This strangely shaped pit is truly a forgotten monument. Isolated in the corner of an old unused taxi ramp at Edwards Air Force Base in the Mojave Desert, this hole in the ground served as the curious starting point for one of the century's most important missions into the unknown. In 1947, this custom-made ditch was built to contain the first of the X-planes, the famous X-1. After the X-1 was positioned in the pit, the B-29 launch aircraft was rolled over. The X-1 would then be hoisted into the bomb bay. The B-29 would launch at mid-air, where in the thin atmosphere and with a full load of fuel it could reach unheard-of speeds and altitudes, and perhaps push mankind through a hole in the mythical sound barrier. In 1939, Ezra Kocher championed a high-speed rocket research aircraft. 5 years later, Bell designer Bob Woods began work on the rocket plane.
This was the force necessary to pierce the sound barrier. To find the proper fuselage to house this power, designers turned to ballistics. From this research emerged a body design based on the symmetry of a .50 caliber bullet. Working on theory alone, Bell engineers brought forth a radical design, which was to become the X-1, first airplane in the world to fly faster than the speed of sound.
There was some concern that part of the stabilization process involved with that .50 caliber slug was the fact that it was rotating at a very high rate of speed, and that there were some gyroscopic entities that came into play to help stabilize the bullet. So there was still an element of question. Nobody was absolutely certain.
By 1945, the project was well underway. The Bell team had proposed an aircraft of incredible strength, withstanding 18 Gs, twice the load of any other aircraft. However, development of the rocket's power plant proved more difficult. Reaction Motors' test program lagged behind the Bell schedule. In January 1946, still without an engine, the first X-1 was ferried to Pine Castle Field, Florida for initial glide flights. Bell test pilot Jack Willems was chosen for the first flights before the Army Air Corps took control. A high-altitude mid-air launch was essential to the project's success. The rocket engine was hungry. A ground takeoff and climb would exhaust the propellants before achieving desired speed. This mid-air launch, pioneered during the glide trials, paved the way for the project's success. On January 25, 1946, Willems and the X-1 dropped from the mothership. The first flights demonstrated how rugged and responsive the X-1 was. The powered flights would soon begin. But Jack Willems would not live to fly the X-1 again. In August 1946, he was tragically killed in a racing plane. In March 1946, a decision was made to move the test flight program to the remote Muroc Air Force Base in the Mojave Desert, California. Willems' place was taken by Chalmers Slick Goodland, an ex-Navy fighter pilot. Goodland had landed the best job in the business, but also the most dangerous. A pilot desperate enough to use the side hatch escape would surely be sliced in half by the wing. By late 1946, the X-1 power plant had been installed, a 4-chamber XLR-11 with a maximum thrust of 6,000 pounds. The X-1 was ready to go. On the 9th of December 1946, the B-29 launch aircraft took off with the second Bell X-1 held snugly in its modified bomb bay. After many years of preparation, the X-1 would be launched on its first powered flight. As the big B-29 climbed up to its predetermined altitude, Goodland made his way down into the X-1 side hatch, twisting himself into the cockpit. Slick Goodland completed 26 flights in the Bell X-1, but during this first powered flight, he felt the true exhilaration of rocket power.
Really dropped like a lead brick. And when I ignited the rocket engine, why, it was like being slapped in the back with a lead shovel, I would say. And the acceleration was quite phenomenal, and certainly I had never experienced anything like that before.
During these flights, Goodland flew the X-1 up to 0.85 Mach. But a financial disagreement with Bell forced him to resign. Project engineer Bob Stanley tried dangling the carrot.
When I resigned, Stanley said, "Well, don't you want to stay and fly the X-2?" And I simply said, "Well, Bob, if your word's no good in the X-1, it's no good in the X-2." So we left on rather unfriendly terms.
The project stalled, but the problems between Bell and Goodland didn't interest the Air Force.
The Air Force took the attitude, well, the airplane's been proven, and why should we spend money to train another civilian test pilot when we have our own pilots who will be eventually flying the aircraft anyway. I have never flown supersonic, and I would like to fly in the Concorde, but I have an objection to paying such a high fare to ride as a passenger.
Some say Slick Goodland could have been the first to fly supersonic, but that wasn't to be. He'd shown the X-1 was capable, but another would be the first. Eager to see results with the X-1, the Air Force selected a 24-year-old fighter pilot, Captain Charles Chuck Yeager.
There were a lot of pilots around who had exceptional flying skills like he did, but it was his concern and interest in trying to know and learn everything about the airplane he could prior to flying it, so that he could thoroughly evaluate it and so that he wouldn't run into any surprises.
Chief of the Flight Test Center, Colonel Al Boyd, had chosen Yeager because of his strong maintenance background. The Air Force would fly the first X-1, which was deemed the faster of the two, pushing this aircraft to the limits as quickly and safely as possible. The NACA, or National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, would fill in the data gaps with the other X-1. For additional speed, the Air Force X-1 was fitted with thinner wings. The project was very much a team effort. Retired General, then Major Bob Cardenas, was the officer in charge and flew the B-29 launch plane.
Dick Frost and Jackie, they were the two scientific geniuses on the project. I just tried to keep things operating, and Chuck stuck his neck out flying it, and then Bob Hoover hung around the edges waiting to see if maybe he'd get the chance to fly it if anything happened to Chuck.
The team was a blend of youth, courage, and know-how, complementing Yeager's natural ability.
Now, he didn't have an aeronautical engineering degree, but Jackie Ridley did. And Jackie Ridley and Chuck Yeager were mentally, mind to mind, they communicated very well. Jackie could explain things to Chuck that other people may not have been able to explain.
As the Air Force completed their first flights, the NACA was preparing its own. Scott Crossfield was one of their X-1 pilots.
There was an awful lot of design room data that the companies wanted. In fact, there would be people waiting for the raw data to come out of those flights so they could go back and apply it to detailed design. It wasn't the gross proof of can we do it or not. It was really the nuts and bolts work of experimental flight tests to gather the data so that there were no catch-22s in there that might affect designs later on.
Jam-packed with propellants, the X-1 held 293 gallons of diluted alcohol and 311 gallons of intensely cold liquid oxygen. The LOX, as it was called, acted as the air supply to keep the alcohol burning. These quantities gave the X-1 an endurance of around 5 minutes. The volatile propellants were handled with great caution. Even so, a ground fuel accident during preparations for the first powered flight of the third X-1 destroyed the research aircraft and its mothership. Built to outperform the first two X-1s with a more advanced turbo fuel pump, greater fuel capacity, and a very thin wing, the third X-1 only completed one unpowered glide flight before its untimely destruction. Mounting a two-pronged NACA Air Force assault on the sound barrier called for a great deal of cooperation. The NACA would examine and flesh out the spectrum of new data from the Air Force's accelerated test program. The X-1 became a way of validating new laboratory methods. It provided a real-world comparison, proof that the new test methods were on the right track.
One thing with aeronautics, we never get in trouble for what we know. It's what we didn't know and didn't anticipate that catches us napping, and that was just filling out all the voids.
Although the X-1 was loaded with test and recording apparatus allowing detailed evaluation of each flight, this kind of equipment was in its infancy. Consequently, a great deal of emphasis was still placed on the pilot's observations. The Air Force team was drawing closer to Mach 1. Yeager, in his 8th flight, had reached .997 Mach. However, at this point, the X-1 suffered severe buffeting and a strange loss of control. Ridley came up with a brilliant idea. He theorized that the X-1's adjustable tail held the answer. Shockwaves moved back along the aircraft the faster it went, eventually disabling the horizontal tail surfaces. Jack Ridley, arguing against expert opinion, believed the use of the moving tail was the key to supersonic flight.
I told Jackie, I said, Jackie, you better be right. I said, you know, if they're right and you're wrong, Chuck's going to be the lucky guy. He's going to be dead. You and I are going to be perennial majors up in Thule, Greenland for the next 30 years. He said, no. He said, they don't understand. I think we can do it. And I said, okay, Chuck, it's your neck. Jackie and I could be punished, but facetiously I said you would be the lucky one. How do you feel? And he said, well, if Jackie says I can do it, I can do it.
Yeager's confidence lay in a thorough knowledge of the aircraft and the certainty that Ridley had given him the answer to control problems. Bell had anticipated such problems, providing a heavy-duty control yoke for maximum leverage. If Ridley was right, such measures wouldn't be called for. But if he was wrong, it could mean tragedy. These lonely ruins a few miles from Edwards are all that's left of Poncho's place, a popular spot for the men on the base. Poncho Barnes herself was a respected aviator, so she could understand the young test pilots like Yeager, who, along with others, treated her as an equal.
Her ranch, or the Happy Bottom Riding Club, was a good country bar. She really had a big cattle, alfalfa, and hog ranch there. Poncho herself was a very unique and marvelous human being. And she could shoot and ride and fly and cuss for the best men in the world, and yet she could serve tea and organdy and lace.
After an evening at Poncho's ranch, Yeager went for a ride in the desert. In the dark, he was thrown by his horse. With 2 broken ribs and in great pain, Yeager feared he'd be deemed unfit for the mission, so he kept it quiet, telling only his friend Jack Ridley. This accident could put the flight in jeopardy. Racked with pain on the morning of October 14, 1947, Yeager doubted he could even close the X-1's hatch.
With these broken ribs, that he couldn't reach and pull the door shut because of the pain that he would be suffering. He needed some kind of leverage to be able to pull this lockdown on the door, if you will. And so Ridley got a broom handle and cut it off, length of broom handle, about maybe 12, 14 inches. And with that, Yeager was able to insert that in the latch and get the leverage he needed to pull the lock down.
At 10 a.m., the B-29 lumbered down the main Muroc strip, and Bob Cardenas started his 20-minute climb to the 20,000-foot launch altitude. The B-29 carrying the fuel-laden X-1 strained for every foot of altitude. About midway through the slow climb, Yeager made his way into the B-29's cold bomb bay. To the right was a small manual elevator. With a bit of persuasion, the elevator was lowered, and Yeager, nursing two broken ribs, bent over and squeezed in through the tight hatchway. Ridley's practical suggestion of the broomstick worked perfectly. The mothership soon reached launch altitude.
When the time came in position, I put power up, plane down, trying to attain the highest possible speed that I could. Chuck always complains I dropped him too slow, but damn thing was shaking. And so I started my countdown, and I went 10, 9, 8, and I always missed 4 or 5. 3, 2, 1, drop.
As soon as he felt clear, Yeager ignited 2 chambers. The X-1 climbed away to 40,000 feet for the speed run. As the rocket gulped the propellants, it became lighter and lighter, helping it go faster and faster. This cockpit footage of an X-1 flight shows the rocket's acceleration. The ignition switch is thrown, and the Mach meter needle can be seen climbing rapidly. Below, the ground crew waited for some sign that the barrier was no more. Yeager tests Jack Ridley's new control system, and it works. At 42,000 feet and 0.92 Mach, he ignites the third rocket, searching for the hole in the wall.
We heard on the radio there, he was hanging up at below 1, and then suddenly the needle just chopped, and he said it. Of course, we heard it on the radio from the station, telemetering station, called us, and I think he's through.
He was through. Yeager had experienced no violent buffeting or other indication that he'd passed a milestone, only the simple jump of the Mach meter needle. He remained supersonic for 20 seconds, and control had been maintained.
Poor old Chuck, he was out there in the middle of the lake. He was standing on the wing while they towed him back. And there wasn't the usual hoopla that there was, with the media and whatnot, because we'd been under wraps to keep this quiet, secret. Jackie and Chuck and I and Hoover and whatnot, we went down into Hollywood, had a drink or two.
The X-1 team had made history. Bell, the NACA, and the Air Force received the 1947 Collier Trophy.
No, it was just a good group. It was a good gathering where somebody threw the right people together for the right thing, and it all went.
Yeager named the Bell X-1 Glamorous Glennis after his wife. It was to go on to achieve many other firsts during its 78 flights. This was its one and only ground takeoff. Even in these low altitudes, only partially full of propellants, the X-1 easily went supersonic. The X-1 was to push the envelope to 1.45 Mach and fly beyond 71,000 feet, proving that there was no sound barrier, no impenetrable wall. Its success laid the groundwork for a whole line of X-planes. Effectively, it was the first step toward the stars. In crossing the threshold of supersonic flight, the Bell X-1 proved indeed that the sky was the limit.
He was born in a big white farmhouse in Myra, West Virginia, just up the Mud River from the Lincoln County seat of Hamlin, one day after Lincoln's birthday in 1923. He was an average student, learned mechanics from his father, and loved to sneak away to hunt and fish. When World War II came, he joined the Army Air Corps as an aircraft mechanic. But by war's end, he was an ace fighter pilot and destined for glory in the air. He was the first man to break the speed of sound in the Bell X-1. He won nearly every aviation award, a peacetime Congressional Medal of Honor, and was the youngest man enshrined into the Aviation Hall of Fame. His name? Charles Elwood Yeager. Chuck was an easygoing boy at Hamlin High School, good at math and typing, played the trombone, and played both football and basketball. But when school was out, you'd find Chuck down by the Mud River with his fishing pole, or out in the woods hunting with his .22 rifle.
Chuck and I used to learn all these hills. We hunt all these hills, squirrel hunt or what have you. And old Chuck will never forget it. On this ridge back here was the Devil's Head, what they call the Devil's Head. We used to go back there. They had a carving in this. Then back this way is the Mall Rock, about 2 miles back in these mountains. Chuck and I used to go back in there, and not only him, but a lot of other boys and girls with us. When we grew up and around in this community, we had a real good time. We didn't have no cars to run around in like they do today, but we did enjoy the hills and the mountains, picking blackberries and what have you.
When high school ended in the summer of 1941, young Yeager immediately joined the Army Air Corps and left home for training in September. He was trained as an aircraft mechanic, first at Mather Field, California, and then at nearby Moffett Field, where he was an AT-6 crew chief. While at Moffett, he applied for the Flying Sergeant's Program, and just 3 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor, he passed his first flight physical and awaited selection. He subsequently was transferred to Victorville, California, as a crew chief on an AT-11, an aircraft used to train bombardiers. And in the spring of 1942, it became the first airplane he ever got a ride in. Corporal Yeager was selected for flight school in July of 1942. He attended primary school at Ryan Field, Hemet, California, and basic school at Gardner Field, Taft, California. After graduation from Luke Field, Arizona in March 1943, Flight Officer Yeager was assigned to the 363rd Fighter Squadron, 357th Fighter Group, Tonopah, Nevada, flying Bell P-39 Era Cobras.
That was up Tonopah in 43 with P-39. The old rancher had about a 20-foot cottonwood up there in front of his house, and he said he wanted to take it out. I took it out with a P-39 wing. I was up there last year, and that tree's still there. It's about 8 feet in diameter, and the branches about 6 feet above the ground. I told the maintenance officer I had a bird. He said it must have been carrying a nest with it.
The fighter group trained at several airfields throughout the West, including Oroville, California. It was in Oroville that Chuck met his future wife, Glennis Stickhouse. Glennis was the social director for the town's USO. And she planned a dance at Chuck's request for the other pilots in the group so they could meet the local girls. Chuck took Glennis. In November 1943, Chuck's fighter group departed Casper, Wyoming for Leiston, England, and their first taste of combat. The group was now flying the North American T-51 Mustang, escorting bombers deep into Europe. On March 4th, 1944, Yeager claimed his first victory, a Messerschmitt Me-109 over Berlin. His celebration was short-lived. The very next day, on his 9th mission, while flying Tail End Charlie on another bomber escort mission over France, a Focke-Wulf 190 shot down Yeager's P-51, Glamorous Glen. Although Chuck was slightly wounded, he evaded German patrols looking for him. And with the help of an old French woodcutter, he was hidden and handed over to the French underground, who eventually moved him to the Pyrenees, where he and other downed aircrew continued to evade into Spain. His final trek to freedom included a hair-raising escape from a German patrol. Once in Spain, he was repatriated with the 357th Fighter Group by mid-May. Regulations prohibited evadees to go back to combat, but Yeager insisted, all the way up the chain of command until he got permission directly from General Eisenhower himself. He returned to his squadron in Leiston, flew 56 more combat missions, shot down 11 more German aircraft, 9 in 2 missions, 5 Me-109s on one mission, and 4 FW-190s in another. 13 in all, including Germany's famed jet, the Me-262. From July to October 1944, Yeager was promoted to second lieutenant, first lieutenant, and captain. Captain Chuck Yeager returned to the United States in February 1945 and went directly to California, picked up Glennis, and took her home to meet his folks. They were married in the parlor of his home in Hamlin on February 26. After a honeymoon in California, he was assigned as an instructor pilot to Perrin Field, Texas. That didn't last long. In July, the Yeagers arrived at Wright Field, where Chuck became the maintenance officer in the Fighter Test Branch Flight Test Division, and was soon participating in test projects on the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star and the Republic P-84 Thunderjet, America's first operational jet fighters. Young Captain Yeager impressed Colonel Albert Boyd, the chief of the Flight Test Division, with his jet air shows he was flying and his understanding of the maintenance needs of airplanes. In December 1945, Colonel Boyd asked Chuck if he'd like to attend test pilot school. When he graduated in August 1947, he was sent to Muroc Air Base, California, as the project pilot for the Bell XS-1.
I remember, and looking at the airplane, I said, man, that thing got speed written all over it, and it did.
In October 1947, at Muroc Desert Test Center in California, history is made by this aircraft, the XS-1, and its pilot, Captain Charles E. Yeager.
I only flew the X-1 about twice a week. And it was fun because I didn't have to work on a lot of other test programs when I got to fly the X-1.
This airplane and this pilot are about to be the first ever to fly faster than the speed of sound. A B-29 will take the XS-1 aloft and launch her at an altitude of about 35,000 feet. The XS-1 is not a military aircraft, but a flying research laboratory designed to test the effects of supersonic flight upon airplanes. It is powered by 4 rocket engines. Its weight empty is less than 5,000 pounds, but it carries 8,000 pounds of fuel. B-29s have done a lot of memorable things,
but none of them ever before had a mission quite like this one. And no airplane ever did what the XS-1 is about to do. Cracking the sound barrier in level flight will be more than a spectacular feat. It will also give the Air Force valuable knowledge of the resources of new propulsive systems. Captain Yeager gets aboard the XS-1. It can't be a long flight he's going to have in the little aircraft. At full power, the flight can't last more than 2.5 minutes. But it's going to be a fast one.
I didn't give any thought to whether or not we were going to get above Mach 1. It just, duty was paramount in my mission.
Ready. The radar crews are ready too, to do the timing. The only possible method for timing aircraft at extremely high altitudes. There she goes. A big moment in a history-making flight. Now she's approaching the barrier. The speed of sound at 35,000 feet is 660 miles per hour. A really big moment. Through the sound barrier. The first time ever.
One thing we found out with the X-1, since it was the first airplane to ever get into the region of the speed of sound and exceed the speed of sound, was that on the horizontal stabilizer, or the tail plane of the airplane, shockwaves were forming. And as we got up to about 94% of the speed of sound, these shockwaves were right at the hinge point of the elevator. And consequently, we lost our elevator effectiveness. And the X-1 had the capability of moving its whole horizontal stabilizer. And that was the way we got the airplane through Mach 1.
For breaking the speed of sound, President Harry Truman presented Captain Chuck Yeager with America's most prestigious aviation award, the Robert J. Collier Trophy for the greatest achievement in aeronautics, and the McKay Trophy for the most meritorious flight of the year. During the next 2 years, Captain Yeager flew the X-1 more than 40 flights, exceeded 1,000 miles per hour, and 70,000 feet. In December 1953, Major Yeager flew the Bell X-1A to 1,650 miles per hour, or 2.5 times the speed of sound. The record almost cost him his life. The X-1A went uncontrollable at 80,000 feet and spun down to 25,000 feet in 51 seconds before Major Yeager was able to regain control and land on the Mojave Lake bed. For his new speed record, Yeager was awarded the Harmon International Trophy by President Eisenhower and was selected one of the 10 outstanding young men of 1953 by the United States Junior Chamber of Commerce. Earlier in 1953, Major Yeager accompanied General Boyd to Kadena Air Base, Okinawa, to fly and evaluate a North Korean MiG-15 whose pilot had defected. Yeager considered this assignment to be one of the most dangerous of his flying career. The MiG was put through every possible test to evaluate the airplane's capability, and they did it all during a severe tropical storm. In October 1954, after more than 9 years of flight test work, Major Yeager became 417th Fighter Bomber Squadron Commander, an F-86 squadron at Hahn Air Base, Germany, and later Toul-Rosières, France. During his tour, he took first place honors in air-to-air and air-to-ground gunnery, ensuring that his wing won the 1956 fighter weapons gunnery meet held in Europe.
I think that Chuck Yeager thinks of himself primarily as a fighter pilot, more than he even thinks of himself as a test pilot. And his combat record certainly indicates this. You know, here was a man who, people who have flown with him and opponents who flew against him have all reflected that this individual was extraordinarily gifted as a combat pilot, and indeed is extraordinarily gifted as an airman today.
In September 1957, Chuck and his family left Europe and returned to the high California desert at George Air Base, just 50 miles from Edwards. Lieutenant Colonel Yeager became the squadron commander of 2 North American F-100 squadrons in succession, the 1st Tactical Fighter Squadron and the 306 Tactical Fighter Squadron. During his days at George, Yeager took his squadrons throughout the world, participating in TAC Strike Force exercises. His squadrons crossed the Atlantic non-stop 2 times, once to serve as an air defense force for the Strategic Air Command at Oron, Spain, and the other in Italy on special weapons alerts. He attended the Air War College at Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama in 1960 and was promoted to full colonel in March 1961. After War College, Chuck Yeager returned to the Air Force Flight Test Center at Edwards, and in June 1962 became the commandant of the United States Air Force Aerospace Research Pilot School.
The rocket engine is used at carefully calculated intervals to boost acceleration. When the aircraft nears the apex of the zoom maneuver and reaches an altitude at which dynamic pressure becomes too low for conventional aerodynamic controls, the reaction controls are activated. At the altitudes attained by the NF-104A, he enjoys a unique view, a byproduct of his mission. The sight is familiar to the astronauts, and now, because of the Zoom flight program, to these future astronauts in training at the Aerospace Pilot School,
as well as future experimental aircraft test pilots. He continued to lead by example, involved in every type of aircraft testing, including the M2 lifting body, the concept vehicle used to study the re-entry needs of future aircraft and spacecraft, such as the present-day Space Shuttle.
The legacy of Chuck Yeager, I think, can really be found in today's test pilots. You know, these are individuals that are highly trained, highly skilled individuals. There has been talk about the so-called right stuff. I think the danger when we look at the test pilot in a strictly popular sense is confusing the sense of recklessness with a sense of adventure. If you look at the history of flight testing and flight research, recklessness has never had a part in it. Chuck Yeager was a supremely adventurous, extremely crafty and shrewd individual, but never a reckless one.
In July 1966, Colonel Yeager returned to operational flying when he became the commander of the 405th Fighter Wing, a B-57 wing at Clark Air Base, Republic of the Philippines, but with 5 squadrons assigned all over Southeast Asia. Even though the job kept him moving, Yeager still managed to fly 127 missions in South Vietnam. In 1969, Yeager became the commander of the 4th Tactical Fighter Wing at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, North Carolina, and was promoted to Brigadier General. While commander of the 4th Tactical Fighter Wing, he led his unit to South Korea to bolster other forces after the North Koreans captured the USS Pueblo and its crew. His next assignments carried him and his family back to Germany, where he was vice commander of the 16th Air Force, then on to Pakistan as U.S. defense representative to that country. General Yeager's last assignment was as Director of Aerospace Safety for the Air Force Inspection and Safety Center at Norton Air Force Base, California. He retired in February 1975.
This man is one of the genuine heroes of the air age. He's a legendary person in terms of his piloting ability and his test pilot acumen in the same sense that we think of, say, Jimmy Doolittle. And just as Doolittle played a transforming role in the development of aviation technology in the 1920s and 1930s, we certainly see Chuck Yeager doing that in the 1940s into the 1950s.
But this was by no means the last we heard of Chuck Yeager. General Yeager continued to test aircraft as a consultant for the Air Force, NASA, and many major aircraft companies.
come a long ways in the last 40-some years when we first started flying Mustangs against the Germans back in 1943, 44, and 45. A lot of things have changed in modern aircraft. We went through a big evolution. After breaking the sound barrier at the X-1, we had airplanes that would fly at supersonic speeds like the F-100 would go out to about 1.3 Mach number. You get in, you shoot, and you get out.
30,000 feet at about 0.95 Mach. I'm going AB now.
50 years to the minute after breaking the barrier in the experimental aircraft named Glamorous Glennis, Chuck Yeager made history once again in the skies over the Mojave Desert.
And we just went through Mach 1.
This anniversary of supersonic flight was about more than just a machine and the speeds it reached above Edwards Air Force Base. This anniversary was instead a time to honor a man who had the courage to fly into the unknown. This anniversary also signaled the end to a test flight career for General Yeager.
What I can say is that what I am, I owe to the Air Force.
Chuck Yeager did it all in airplanes and research flying. An ace in World War II, the first to break the speed of sound, he won nearly every aviation award available, received a special peacetime Congressional Medal of Honor, and was the youngest person ever enshrined in the Aviation Hall of Fame. And for this, he is a legend of air power.
One of the many legendary planes designed by one of the world's most awarded aviation designers, Kelly Johnson. From Kelly's initial concepts in 1952 through the painstaking development, then wonder what could have been after the last 104 was produced in 1983. Production run that lasted over 30 years. Kelly Johnson first came to the Lockheed Company in 1933 and was hired as only the sixth engineer of the fledgling company. He'd come to the notice of company engineers when he was supervising the wind tunnel testings at the company's Electra at the University of Michigan. His insights and constructive concepts on the Electra and subsequently the Hudson bomber led to his rapid rise in the company. The Hudson bomber Kelly single-handedly designed at the age of 29 was then redesigned to meet the British specifications in a number of days in his hotel room to seal the Lockheed order, which eventually ran to 3,500 planes. Kelly's list of achievements is stunning, such as having input in over 40 of the world's most renowned aircraft, and over half of these were his original design. his innovative and intuitive work brought great reward for the company. One outstanding example of his unconventional design concepts is the P-38 Lockheed Lightning. America's first 400-mile-per-hour fighter, the design was totally unique for the time. Two-engined, using liquid-cooled inline instead of radial engines, tricycle landing gear, overwhelming operating ranges and payloads, yet able to outmaneuver many single-engine fighters. The dual-boom fuselage concept was totally at odds with the thinking of the day, but showed the design's daring at that time. After significant testing and development and several years of operation, the P-38 became an amazing fighter by any consideration. It could fly farther, faster, at a greater height, and carry much more payload than any other fighter. After the war in the Pacific, the drive to develop military aircraft took a sidestep in favor of domestic planes and development of jet engines. However, with the onset of the war in Korea, the sheer numbers of the Russian MiG-15 shelved many with the state of the Russian planes' development. The American pilots flying their Sabres, who were used to their air superiority, were being increasingly pushed in the air war by the MiG-15s. At Lockheed, the direction of future projects had been varying between using the existing engines in lighter planes or heavier, more powerful planes based on the concept of new jet engine. Kelly Johnson, on his visit to Korea, was left in no doubt about the requirements for the next step forward. The American pilots he'd spoken to were demanding a plane with vastly better speed, height, and climb parameters. With the need to be higher, faster, and to be there quicker, Kelly's decision was for a lightweight fighter designed for high subsonic cruise and high supersonic combat speeds. Almost immediately, the most controversial point of the 104's design was decided upon: its incomparably small, thin wing. This flew in the face of the design thinking of the time, which was the largest swept wings on all transonic planes. Soon, many wing designs of this concept were being wind tunnel tested. Then, more unconventionally tested, bolted onto Army 5-inch rockets. These proved to be a very valuable tool for the testing of not only the design's limitations of shape and construction, but also the stresses speed and acceleration would cause at lower altitude. The next point of the wing controversy was that the wings were to be bolted onto the sides of the fuselage with precision forged aluminium fittings, not going through the plane, as with most planes of the day. With such small wings, they required a totally new boundary layer control system. The wings needed leading edge and trailing edge flaps, and a boundary layer control system which is used in conjunction with the trailing edge flaps to reduce landing speeds of this manned missile. The first step in the manufacture was the building of the model fuselages in full scale and the creation of the jigs to cradle the entire plane. As the Air Force had not asked for submissions for the 104, if it were not for the credibility of Lockheed and Kelly Johnson and the lessons being learnt in Korea, the 104 may never have gone into production. As it was, they were impressed and perceived a need enough to order prototype testing on an experimental contract. In March 1953, the contract was issued and Lockheed went straight into production of the first two prototypes. The first flight took place only 12 months after the signature of the contract. The achievements in that 12 months are stunning. Its concept had only been developed in late 1952. It wasn't some idea that had been sitting on the file for an extended period. This was on the cutting edge of technology for the time. On March 4, 1954, the 104 made its first official test flight. After an extensive testing sequence at the flight controls, the test pilot, Tony LaVia, took to the air for the first time. Although the engine used in the test aircraft couldn't push the plane past Mach 2, Lockheed's design and concepts of the lightweight interceptor were decisively proven. In spite of the prototype's tests not achieving the airframe's Mach 2 speed, the US Air Force placed an order for 15 more planes and uprated power plants as F-104As. In April of 1955, one of these broke the Mach 2 barrier. With the long development period and the plane's extreme performance being very unforgiving on an unwary pilot, a test flight sequence of over 8,000 flights using 52 aircraft still left a guarded attitude with the Air Force, and Lockheed were left with the inference that the plane was still on trial. The contracts issued were the first to be on a fix-then-fly basis. Previously, the Air Force would assume some of the testing itself. With the cutting-edge technology of the 104, the responsibility was returned to the manufacturer. This is now the accepted practice. The 104 concept arrived at the overlap of two technology ages, which meant that almost all of it was untried. One of the best examples of this is the Vulcan M61 cannon. 6 foot long and 308 pounds in weight, mounted on the nose, it could fire 6,000 20mm cannon shells in a minute. The 6 rotating barrels, firing one at a time, emitted a high rate of fire, while at the same time reducing the problem of barrel wear and heat generation. It also virtually eliminated the problems associated with recoil. Being driven electrically from the plane reduced the problems of corrosion and fouling. At the time, it was the fastest gun of its kind in the world. Comparisons to even the existing multiple machine gun installations are almost meaningless, because the Vulcan outperformed everything else by such a margin of superiority. The troubles it caused in the 104 should be accepted as the trialing of any piece of advanced technology. At first testing of the gun, the pilot, Tony LaVia, after a perfect initial test, proceeded to the second pass. When firing the gun, the plane lost all engine power. He was then forced to glide back to land, soon committing himself to passing below the level which was safe to use the ejection seat. After his hair-raising landing, it was confirmed that the gun had caused the problem. One of the shells had ejected backwards through the base plate and into the plane. With the sheer performance of the plane and its weapons expansion and wider tactical capability, it was now the yardstick by which all others were measured. In 1958 and 59, it set new records in many fields to reinforce its potency. Even when the new F-4 Phantom II broke some of its records, the 104 went out and set them again outside the F-4's capabilities. As the prospect of significant US Air Force orders diminished, another market quietly revealed itself in Europe. The sales program outside of the US not only saved the 104 project, but made it into an outstanding success for Lockheed. The Starfighter eventually went into service with 14 air forces and was the nearest to a standard Western fighter aircraft to be achieved. The control systems were tailor-made for individual air forces, and it was put to many and varied uses. One design that saved the 104 was the two-seat variant. US fighters usually included a two-seat version for reconnaissance or training. The Starfighter was no exception. The German Luftwaffe were primarily looking for a ground strike aircraft, but also a multitasking platform for various developing areas. The twin-seat variant was particularly appealing to them. Many more abilities which had been deliberately omitted from the original design were now being considered. As the NATO alliance was seeking to standardize their air forces, the German order was seen as opening this market to Lockheed. The Luftwaffe order was so important to Lockheed that some almost incomprehensible capacities were required from the plane, including barrier landing strength. The Starfighter itself held no problems in coping with enforced rapid deceleration, but the challenge to the pilots was another thing entirely. The whole concept required courage and nerves of steel in bringing it to a successful and safe conclusion. One other more definable addition to the package was the facility of in-flight refueling, by today's standard a mundane requirement of almost all fighter aircraft. Extensive trial and error testing and retesting of the new technology in various forms from myriad tanker aircraft delivered the ability and vastly extended the operational range of the Starfighter. Lockheed's production offset sales strategy would see Starfighters manufactured by groups of different European aviation factories. This was the clinching factor in the sales campaign, as it would provide a much-needed boost to the ailing European aviation industry in general. The competition for the contract was very serious, and some of the other competitors were very good aircraft. But by the time it was over, the 104 proved itself to be the outstanding aircraft in the competition. The plane performed effortlessly in the fly-offs, and its edge on the other competitors was so obvious that it was almost no contest at all. By this time, the Starfighter had developed a reputation of demanding the best from its pilots and being very unforgiving if mishandled. But it also had a reputation as being the hottest thing in the air. A well-maintained 104 in the hands of a trained pilot had very few problems, but in the hands of untrained personnel, many accidents occurred. In spite of the common knowledge that the German Luftwaffe had a particularly troubling time with their 104s, losing over 200 planes in accidents, little if any blame can be attached to the aircraft itself. No other customer had any experiences even remotely similar to the German problems. The customer air forces developed many different roles for the 104. In fact, some aspects of the plane were still under development when the last ones rolled out in 1983. When the American Air Force chose not to accept the 104 as a major part of its inventory, it took on many of the other Century fighters. These were all much larger planes that shared, with varied degrees of success, state-of-the-art technology. The 100 Super Saver, the 101 Voodoo, the 106 Delta Dagger Delta Dart were all part of the series and all disappeared into the annals of history very quickly, even with some limited service in the air over Vietnam. Each of these planes, as fighter interceptor aircraft, took on the guise of a roving missile platform, although with time, each was developed into other varied roles. The Russian Air Force had also learned many lessons in Korea. Their outstanding MiG-15s had now developed along very different lines to the Americans and had become the MiG-17. MiG-17 was built to be a short-range interception fighter with very high performance, rate of climb and turn. The MiG-17s were in reality an updated MiG-15 with more swept wings and better handling. The MiG-17 was produced in very large numbers, although it should have been obsolete before it even took to the air. But it proved a very effective plane in the air over Vietnam in the mid-60s. It's doubtful if any of the planes in this era could have coped against the 104. Even today's more modern planes would have some problems with the performance of the 104. The 104, later redesigned with larger wings and much more maneuverability as the Lancer, was entered as a concept in the competition that brought the F-15 to mass production. It would seem that the Lancer, for some reason in the thinking of the time, failed to impress, and none were ever put into production. Kelly Johnson maintained that the Lancer would have rung rings around the F-15 and thereby everything else at the time. There's even a body of opinion that says in aerial combat, the 104 itself would give the F-15 significant problems. Although the last of the Starfighters was built in 1903, these exceptional aircraft served for many years but were finally withdrawn from service by the mid-1990s. The only variant still surviving is the F-104S, built under license by Alenia in Italy, for use in Italy and Turkey. Despite the age of the F-104, the S model has proven to be cost-effective, reliable, and popular among pilots, giving the F-104 a new lease of life into the new century. The attention to detail and scrutiny of the plane through its long development is without precedent, and it set the ground rules for today's methods and technology of testing. These areas have never been the same since. Despite never being free of controversy, it has more than validated the decisions of its designers and carved its name forever in the pages of the aeronautic history.
Sir, if I can ask you the tough question first, if you could give us your name and the spelling of your name.
My name is Albert Scott Crossfield, Jr. ALBERTSCOTTCROSSFIELD JR.
With a period at the end.
Yeah.
Where were you born, sir?
I was born in Berkeley, California.
What was life like in Berkeley in those days?
I don't know. We left Berkeley when I was less than a year old. My father was a professor at University of California, and a petroleum chemist that worked for the Union Oil Company there at Oleum. In fact, he helped build that refinery there.
Where did you move to?
We moved from there to Long Beach and then to Wilmington, California, which is the harbor of Los Angeles. And my father was material in building that big Union Oil refinery there on the hill in San Pedro, and he was superintendent of that refinery.
What was your childhood like?
What was it like? Well, I was a kid. No, I was raised mostly in Wilmington till I was about 14 years old. I was not well as a youngster. Had rheumatic fever very badly, which should have precluded all of my flight career, but I never let anybody know it. And 1935, when I was 14, we moved to the state of Washington. It was Depression days. My father was in the oil business, and that wasn't doing well, and he wanted to get back to the land and get away from the business world, which wasn't doing very well in the early 30s. So we moved up to a farm in the state of Washington, and he and I built that farm over the next few years and got it back on a profitable basis. Probably was a godsend for me in my physical condition because I didn't have time, wasn't allowed to be sick. That was my father's nature. And I got to be a pretty strong farm kid and managed to get along pretty well after that physically.
You had your first ride in a plane when you were 6?
Yeah, I rode in an Alexander Eagle Rock with a guy named Carl Lenish, who was a chemist for the Union Oil Company and had been a World War I military pilot. And as collateral duties of the company, he used to fly the company airplanes. The Union Oil Company, I think, probably started the first business aviation fleet. And my father was a good friend of his. And he flew me, I believe, the first flight I ever had, he flew me from Monrovia Airport to Burbank, where we saw Pancho Barnes. And I've known her ever since, or known of her mostly. Of course, I was just a little kid. She didn't have much to do with little kids in those days. And she was typically Pancho Barnes. A heart as big as the world, goggles shoved back on her helmet, on her head, smoking black Mexican cigarillos, and murdering the Queen's English with 4-letter words in every sentence, and quite a gal.
So was that where the love of aviation came from, that first flight?
I think it was my generation. What was exciting, all through the 20s and 30s were airplanes. And we all built model airplanes from the time we could hold a stick. Free flight models. Learned an awful lot from the model airplane news and all of us getting together and competing. And it may have helped. Undoubtedly it helped, but I went to sleep on that first flight up in the front cockpit. They tell me. I don't really remember if I did or not. But no, my generation was aviation oriented, much as this generation's computer oriented.
So when you were 12, you started taking flying lessons at 12?
At Wilmington Airport in California, it was right up where now the Figueroa Freeway goes through Wilmington. Was an old slough, and a guy named Von McNulty was starving to death on that airport. And he needed a newspaper, so I delivered him a newspaper all month long, the Long Beach Press Telegram. And he and helped him clean up his airplanes from the mud on that slough. And my reward was about a half hour, an hour flight instruction every month. That's where I started.
What did it feel like to be flying a plane at the age of 12?
At 12 or any time you're flying, you don't take time for psychological analysis. I enjoyed it. I thought it was the way to go. That's about all I could say.
Now, where were you when you heard that Pearl Harbor had been bombed?
I was working for Boeing that Sunday morning. We were working overtime. I worked on the A-20 line at Boeing in Seattle. And the news came over. There weren't too many people in the plant on Sunday. And I heard that, and of course we didn't do much work that day. We listened to the radio and speculated. And I frankly thought this is going to be a biggie. And I have to get in it, and probably won't live through it. Generally, that had to be the attitude. You see, we're taking on two of the biggest navies and armies in the world. But I went to the University of Washington in 1940, and in 41, I quit that fall to go to Boeing to make enough money to go to school. I'd run out of money.
You thought that there was a good possibility that you would die in the war?
Well, that's a probability of anybody in a war, and I was determined I was going to fly in the war. I knew damn good and well I had a bigger job getting into the Air Corps and the Navy than I had flying. And I managed to work that through many devious channels. And I went into the Air Force right after Pearl Harbor. And they sent me down to Willie Field, Arizona, and it was just a sea of young people. And we just got off the train, and they gave us a ticket home and said, "Don't call us, we'll call you." You know, they couldn't feed them, they had no clothes for them. Everybody joined. So I went back and got my job back at Boeing for a while, and decided if this war is going to be over for, I can go win it. And so I switched over and went over to the Navy, and they were glad to snatch up a potential Army recruit. And so I was in the Navy for the 4 years of World War II.
What did you do during the war, sir?
I was an instructor and fighter and gunnery instructor at Corpus Christi, Texas, most of the war, up for 32 months. And in 1944, I finally got orders to the fleet. And ended up after a few moves with Air Group 51, and we were staging for the invasion when the war was over.
Where were you when you heard about that the bomb had been dropped?
Pearl Harbor. The day the bomb had dropped, we were flying a lot of patrols over Pearl Harbor because the Navy was real goosey about what the Japanese might do. And I'll never forget that day because as far as I could see were ships. Ships of the line, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, carriers, 200 carriers, I'd guess, loaded to the gunnels with airplanes, troop ships low in the water, supply ships. They're sitting up at 30,000 feet just putting in the time in case there was some kind of a raid on us. And I can remember just thinking, in less than a month, all of that's going to be on the bottom because it was going to be a tough fight to get into Japan. They had 5 air groups assigned to my ship for the first week, not 5 pilots, 5 air groups, if she were still afloat. We were going to support the 2nd Marines going in right below Tokyo, and they were at double strength and had another double strength division right behind them, figuring they'd be pretty well wiped out the first day. And we knew that there was no way we were going to get back from that one. And our ship was pulling out the next day, actually, so I don't know how soon the invasion would have been. Got back to Pearl, and when I got back, something had happened. And we didn't know what. We didn't know if it was good or bad, but something had happened. The atmosphere just told you that. And then that night, actually we went back to Maui. We flew back to Maui that night. And that night the the word came out they dropped this bomb, and that had probably signaled the end of the war. Some celebration on that island. These people that have ventured, the Japanese were about to give up. They're absolutely wrong. They're trying to rewrite history, which is kind of what we were fighting. This was a religious war by then. It was an ethnic and religious war. They had 10,000 kamikazes waiting for us, and everything in the world to throw at us going in there. It would have been one heck of a landing to make that one, because we didn't have Britain 30 miles behind us with San Diego 3,000 miles away. You know, and that was going to be a very interesting. I think we would have won it, but it would have been a terrible price. Thank God for that bomb. Thank God for Tibbets.
When you heard that the bomb had been dropped, did everyone realize the war was over at that point, or did they?
No, but it was a big plus. And then when the second bomb was dropped, it pretty well concluded that the war was coming to an end fast. They couldn't take a beating like that, particularly after we saw the results. You know, the word got out pretty fast, and the pictures. And we had been pretty close to the intelligence on the war for quite a while, in the air groups that were going in. And everything was 180 degrees reversed. Going in, it was going to be a tough thing. And we were working, incidentally, for about almost 8 weeks with the 2nd Marines, using live ammunition, supporting them on several times a week. They'd make a landing on Maui, and we would work out how we were going to go into Japan. And it didn't look like it was doable, but we would have done it. So it was just really the mass of people we would have thrown at. So we knew the war was over. We were pretty sure it was coming to a close pretty fast that night. That was quite a celebration.
What was going on? The celebration? What type of celebration?
Well, everybody got drunk and disorderly. How do military men celebrate?
After World War II, you were back to school?
I went back to University of Washington, started to work at University of Washington wind tunnel, and stayed there until 49. I took most of my engineering over because I'd forgotten so much of it. And then Engine Charlie Wilson was Secretary of Defense at that time, I guess Secretary of War, huh? I've forgotten when they changed that. Defense. And he wasn't hiring anybody, and I could make more money working for the university, so I stayed and got our master's degree in aeronautical engineering, and then in 1950. In the meantime, I'd worked with the Navy to build the reserves up. Originally, they didn't have any money for a couple of years for pay, but we knew that we had to hold the capability together. I had a lot of fun then, too. I had the 13th Naval District aerobatics team and Corsairs. That was a lot of fun.
At what point did you get to Edwards?
When I graduated, I went to Edwards in June of 1950. There wasn't much money in being an engineer in those days, and so it occurred to me that if I went back to flying, I could add something to it. I hadn't really planned on doing that. It was one of the options, but it, wasn't my main one. And I went to hitched a ride with the Navy down to Moffett Field, and I'd heard they had an opening down there, but I decided not to ask them if I could come down because they'd say, "Oh, I'll come down in a couple of weeks or make an appointment." It'd be too late, so I just went down and walked in their office. Surprisingly enough, they were expecting me. And my wife, who had never opened mail in her life of mine before that or since then, saw a letter that came from NACA and thought maybe that was important. So she opened it, and there was a request to negotiate for an interview with Edwards people at what was then the high-speed flight station. So being at Moffett Field, I got myself down to Edwards and beat everybody else there that letter had gotten to. And I was hired by Walt Williams as an aeronautical research pilot from the NACA.
Did you know much about the program before that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we've been following the X-1. In fact, I volunteered to fly the X-1 for nothing when Slick Goodland was trying to get all that big money. I thought that might be a pretty good step in the profession.
You were actually the first one to fly the X-1, weren't you?
No. Slick Goodland first flew the X-1, and then a number of Air Force pilots, including Charlie Yeager, Chuck Yeager. He doesn't like Charlie. I call him Charlie because Pete Everest introduced me to him as Charlie one time, and I thought all his friends call him Charlie, so I started doing that. Got to be a habit, but I think I'm probably not good enough friend of his to call him Charlie. No, he was the first to fly Mach 1 in the X-1, and that would have been in 1948. That's before I got there.
It says in one of your introductions that you are the only pilot who has ever worn out a pressure suit. Is that true?
I don't know. It could be. I wore a lot of pressure suits and helped develop our first full pressure suit, but that could be. I wore it a lot of times.
You logged a lot of miles, didn't you? A lot of hours.
Not a lot of hours. You know, I've got, I think, somewhere around 130, 140 rocket flights and only about 40 hours. They're not too long flights.
To somebody, most of us who will never be able to do that, describe what that's like.
It's a challenge. It's a lot of fun. It could be dangerous if you weren't up on the edge of your seat paying attention to business. And that's about all I can describe of it. We really wrote the book for almost everything we've done in aeronautics with the research airplanes in those days. And we never really had much in the way of information in the transonic area. Nobody did. And we gathered it all with those airplanes, with a variety of configurations and power plants and that sort of thing to see which way to go. And we used small rocket engines in those days. In fact, we did almost all the successful rocket work in spite of all of the publicity that the Germans brought the rockets over here. When they got over here, they all we know is what Goddard taught us. And before that crowd at Huntsville ever made one that worked, I had 50 rocket flights and several rocket airplanes at that time. And so we pioneered the rocket business. They're small, but it's a matter of caliber, not system. They were identical systems. And the X-1, of course, was first to Mach 1. The X-2 was built to go to Mach 5. The X-3 was to look at thin wing configurations. The X-4 was a tailless airplane. The X-5 was a variable sweep airplane. It was just looking at everything we could imagine. The XF-92 was a Delta. I flew all of those airplanes except the X-2 and the X-3. The D-5581 and 2 were Navy-funded airplanes in the same program. They just didn't put an X on them. They just left the manufacturer's number on them. And actually, the D-5581 was a jet-powered X-1 that would be able to sustain periods of time at high speeds. Not as high as the X-1, though. I don't believe it ever went supersonic. I think Gene May claimed it did, but I don't know if it really did or not. The D-5582 wrote the book for all of our swept-wing airplanes today. Really, it was the real workhorse to gain all of the information we needed for transonic swept wings. And almost everything on our airliners and our fighters today came out of that basic work.
Describe the atmosphere at that time at Edwards, what the people were like, what it was like, whether you guys knew you were making history.
It was so different from today, it's awful hard to describe it. It's like a small town, you knew everybody. We put more faith in our professional judgment than we did in computers and endorsements and agreements and all of that, and never once thought of insurance or risk. Well, we thought of risk, but we calculated that. We didn't calculate it, we thought it out pretty much, and it proved to be a good way to do it. And it was very disciplined in the way we did it, but not technically disciplined because we didn't know. And very often every flight for weeks would be into an area that we hadn't gone into. And all of it was on the envelopes of these airplanes that had unknown characteristics, but we solved a lot of problems. The problems with tailless swept-wing airplanes that killed Jeffrey de Havilland and made such a problem for the Navy. I've forgotten what's the one that Chance Vaught made, their tailless airplane. We found out why those airplanes, we didn't solve the problem, we found out why those airplanes were given so many problems. Well, with the supersonic airplanes, they were all rockets then. We there at NACA, or I did, with Bill Bridgman from Douglas, figured out how to fly in the region's so-called supersonic yaw that was supposed to be lethal, that did end Yeager and Murray and Mel App. And we learned to handle that. Those things taught us how to get there next time around, like with the X-15 and the X-2. But mainly it was to find out those characteristics an airplane had to have so it could be controlled by a man and, as part of the system. And handling qualities were the main things we were looking for. Pitch up was a characteristic of swept wings. It was very, it gets your attention. The airplane would pitch up low altitude where the air was dense, it'd pitch up to destruction. At higher altitudes where we did it, it would pitch up to stall. We found ways to relieve or inhibit that. And that's what that was all. It was all experimental, and really one good experiment's worth all the calculations in the world, because we're not smart enough to outguess Mother Nature without going out and try it.
Was it a very competitive place? You all competitive with one another?
Yes. I'm not supposed to say, oh no, we were all a team. That's a bunch of baloney. Fighter ops were down the runway from us. This was originally when I went there, a little 5,000-foot strip and some Butler and World War II buildings. And we got more done there in that atmosphere than we did when the place got real formal with a lot of permanent buildings. But they're all fighter pilots, and they're born competitive, and if they weren't, they sure were taught to be during the war. And so people say, how were you chosen to be a rocket pilot? I wasn't chosen, I chose myself. That's what I was going to do, and I won my spurs. So did other guys, a lot more. I mean, I wasn't alone in doing that. It was a strange business. Actually, the way it was run at the old NACA there would be a delight to run something like that today. People trusted one another. The engineers, and I'm an engineer, and I and the head of the station were talking about tomorrow's flight, and I was uncomfortable about something. He always said, you heard the pilot, and he gave me 24 hours to decide what to do about it, or to go do it anyway, or not do it. But he always gave me that latitude. So it gave us an opportunity to think out what we were doing. And you never were pressured, even though probably I was the most pressured at that. I hated just sitting around waiting for, it was not a fast-moving business. Research never is, And in those days, we had no truck with publicity or that sort of thing. It was beneath us. We were technical people. We were research people. We didn't need all those flocks screwing around with us. But that thing was changing pretty fast about early 1950s. And we were approaching the McNamara era where everything had to be very carefully orchestrated and in a fishbowl. And so it was fun. And we then flew 11 research airplanes in the early 50s. with 70 people, all up, including the janitors, out of one hangar at the South Base at Edwards, and never been duplicated because we were on our own doing what we thought we could do and didn't have to clear it with anybody and weren't worried about making a mistake in front of the public. So that's been the biggest inhibition on progress that I think anything that's happened since World War II. And as an aside, that generation that came out of the Depression and World War II was very remarkable. And what we did with technology after the war, during the war, and after the war was really no precedent in history for it. But the bureaucracy that that generation built, there's been no precedent for. We even made the Russians look like bikers. Still are. So, and that's really the big burden that everything is carrying, huh?
Did your background as an engineer give you kind of a leg up on most of the other pilots?
Yes and no. In the first place, it would be a criticism of the other pilots if I said it did, but that was the beginning of the era when almost all test pilots required to have an aeronautical or an engineering degree and that sort of thing. Things were changing then. Actually, Eddie Allen, who was an NACA pilot in the early 20s, was a legitimate doctor in his own right, and so was Jim Doolittle. And that really was where the precedent came from. After the war, we had a lot of goggles and flying scarf fighter pilots who were doggone good aviators and did most of the test flying, but really didn't wholly participate in the analysis and determination of what that was doing. During the 50s, that all changed. And at that time, the Air Force had a very strong inclination to want to be in on first flights and all of that. They soon found that that wasn't their business. Huh? They were weapon system evaluators and not engineers. And so that came and went. And from then on, though, almost all Air Force and civilian test pilots were degreed engineers.
What makes a great test pilot?
I don't know what makes a beautiful woman, huh? I don't know. If you test pilots, I've seen them. They're tall and slim and short and fat. And they're just all kinds. I never did know what made a fighter pilot, and I trained hundreds of them. I never could anticipate by getting to know a student, whether he was going to be good, bad, or indifferent. I never did know whether you had to push them or pull them or make them mad at you to make them do their best. I did know that the only thing I could do to make them do their best, it's the best I could do for them. Well, test pilots, you know, it's got a lot of press and a lot of movies and a lot of stuff, but it's a good professional way to close the circle of engineering, you know, from concept all the way through the 7 steps to a finished product. Never before did we close it in engineering. We gave it to a pilot to see if it would work, and now he closed the circle. It's a dangerous business. If you claim that you never got scared, you're a liar and you shouldn't be a test pilot. You didn't have good sense. If you admitted you got scared, you probably shouldn't be a test pilot either, but except to yourself. And, it took an immense amount of concentration to not make those mistakes that very often could be fatal.
In the public's mind, I think test pilots are, excuse me, they're viewed as daredevils, but it's exactly the opposite, isn't it?
It became that way. Originally, right after the war, or, well, not necessarily all the time, because certainly the Wrights were good test pilots, the best in the world, weren't they? And they weren't daredevils, but they dared. And this is all the way up through the men who really carried aviation on its back when it had no precedent, no basis. In fact, we did much better before we had a history than we've done since we had a history. But out of World War II, of course, there were a lot of guys came out of the war still hyped up from the war, and a lot of them became test pilots. And some of the best pilots in both military services, that's the route they chose to take. They were inclined to be, I want to put it right, they weren't daredevils because they had good sense and they knew what they were doing. It is to be less introspective into what they were doing, and they wanted to fly. They loved to fly. That's probably one of the things that's a criteria for a test pilot. If he doesn't like to fly, he's got no business doing that kind of work. And then test pilots are all different too. Testing is a pretty broad profession. The work I was doing was so-called research, where we were finding out what the aerodynamics of different configurations of airplanes were. Test flying for a corporation was to see if our latest attempt to use all of those data and make a useful, applicable device were. That's a different thing. It's a demonstration of our engineering rather than a seeking of engineering parameters.
Now, you were the first pilot to, at least unofficially, go past Mach 3?
Unofficially, yeah. I knew Joe Walker was going to try it within a week or two, and so I had the opportunity, and I bumped that Mach meter up against Mach 3, and I didn't dare tell anybody, because that's very unprofessional. One, trying to steal another guy's plan, and two, doing what you didn't have on your flight plan. I'd fire a pilot that did that.
What was it like?
Nothing, just a number on a dial. I'm not even sure the number was good, because in those days we didn't have all that good of instruments. We should have, the instruments that were recording the stuff in the X-15, which is what I did it in, would have determined it. But what I got from the Mach meter in the cockpit probably was Mach 3. But I just did it so I could have that personal satisfaction. I didn't admit it for a long time.
Do you ever look back on those days and say, boy, I'm lucky to be alive right now. I did some crazy things, or things I didn't even know were crazy at the time?
I never dwelled on it in that regard. I knew the hazards of aviation. Of course, I lost an awful lot of friends in airplanes, because it's really all I've been involved in, particularly during the war. But aviation's not as dangerous as you'd like to. I was the engineering officer of a training squadron as a collateral duty in World War II down Corpus Christi. And in my tour in that squadron, we flew 550,000 hours. Now that's a lot of hours. And we had 11 fatalities, instructors and students. When you think of that, pushing all those young people in through for the war, not letting up at all on them, that's pretty remarkable. For the research airplanes, we flew for 30 years, and we lost 5 pilots. And that's not bad. Now, that's not the high hours that we're talking about. But, and every one of those were dead before they left the ground, and that is, somebody made a mistake and going to do something they couldn't handle. And some of them were pretty close and lived through it. Charlie Yeager survived a couple of real close ones.
Tell me a little bit about the X-15.
Well, the X-15 was to be the natural follow-on to the X-2, which fell out of the picture pretty early. So it was a very unique kind of an airplane, and it did not have a good reputation amongst the people who had all the answers. Kelly Johnson said it would do nothing but prove the bravery of the pilot. Well, in the end, it turned out to be one of the most productive research vehicles we ever had, and probably paved a lot of ground going into space that we wouldn't have had information on, both with atmosphere, heating rates, aerodynamics, and all those things that it takes. The X-15 originally was planned to go 6,600 feet per second, fly 250,000 feet, and it did that. when we first proposed it, I decided that I was going to follow that airplane. I didn't want to leave the committee, but it was just such an opportunity that I made a deal with 2 or 3 of the manufacturers that I wanted to talk to them about working on the airplane during its whole development and manufacture as an engineer, and then take it into flight test. North American got it, and I got that opportunity. And I was 3 years in the design group on the X-15. I think I contributed to it. And then I took it into flight test and did the demonstration flights on it. And that was very interesting. The X-15 was like a fucking stallion, I'll tell you. It was going to kill me, or we were in a Mexican standoff for a while. But we finally broke it, and it turned out to be a good mount.
What are you most proud of in your career?
Just a good professional try. No particular thing. I'm proud of the X-15, but I can't be because so many people had so much to do with it, who none of whom could have, or all of whom would have been missed terribly. And so just seeing an opportunity, that came out of the war, and for me, what I wanted to do, and taking advantage of that as much as I could. I'd like to go back and do some of it over again, but I don't have any particular single moment.
What would you like to go back and do over again?
Oh, professionally, I think maybe I could have hung in there a little bit better. I was inclined to stand on principle when all that did was get me kicked off a program, so I couldn't do anything about what I was arguing about. That doesn't make very good sense in hindsight, does it? And a lot of people do that, I got fired 3 times, and I'm pretty proud of twice. So.
Was mostly the bureaucracy that you were fighting against?
Not the bureaucracy. I don't know how to discuss those things without being negative, huh? And it serves no purpose. I got fired off of the Apollo because I stood up against NASA. And you didn't stand up against NASA, particularly if you were a customer who was getting $2 billion a year out of them. So NASA recommended North American that I be removed from the job, and I was on the Apollo. Frankly, though, I think that what we were fighting for, we won, and we got to the moon, and that was to discipline these things without any yielding to those disciplines that would guarantee that Armstrong would get back. My first battle with NASA was 3 years before the fire. We knew it was going to happen, and we fought like hell to find another way to do that ground test where we were going to have that very high total pressure of pure oxygen in that cockpit. But no, sir, NASA was going to do it their way, and I was told to shut up or get off the program. So I shut up. I regret that. And it wasn't that we were so smart, but we could demonstrate that explosion was almost inevitable. And that wasn't because we were so smart, because there had already been 2 men killed in identical circumstances, one at the School of Aviation Medicine, San Antonio, one at Wright Field. They kept that pretty quiet over the years. NASA knew that. But we had demonstrated at that time, I owned all the quality control, reliability engineering, and systems test on Apollo. And we were doing an incredible job. In 3 years, we went from 3,500 to 35,000, and we're testing hardware that was going to go to the moon. And those were long, hard days. But NASA did not like to be disagreed with. And I wouldn't criticize it, but Jim Webb blamed the company for that fire. And the company fought him tooth and nail against doing that. Both the aeromedical people and those of us in engineering. I did because I didn't know how we were going to test this thing at sea level. In space, 100% oxygen atmosphere is quite safe. It's only 5 psi absolute. But on the ground, it's 5 plus 15 atmospheric. It's 20 pounds absolute, and it's a thermite bomb. So it's those kinds of things that I stood up for that got me in trouble professionally, and so finally I just had to go to the airlines and work for them.
In terms of NASA, do you think there was too much pressure to get to the moon by the end of the 60s?
No, it was doable, and we did it. And a lot of things came up, and a lot of changes were made. It was hard to do, no question about it. No, that program was a killer, but it shows what we can do if we get a national commitment. Sometimes you wonder if we can't afford to assassinate a few more presidents so we can get national commitments, you know, which is not a very nice way to look at it, but that's what made it so that we all work together. And when this country decides to do something and they all work together, nothing's impossible. Nothing. I don't think anything is. It would be very difficult to go back to the moon right now because it'd be a political battle for money over everything, you know. But at those times when Jack died, well, that was his dream, and nobody dared vote against it, which is kind of good. It caught us back from our embarrassment of the Russians whipping our tail in space the way they were, with airplanes and space. You know, they were doing an incredibly good job. At first with a supersonic transport, they beat us with a Mach 3 fighter. First in space, first with an animal in space, first with a man in space, and they've had that laboratory up there in space for 20 years. So all of us bragging. Well, the going to the moon kind of tempers a lot of that. We had a bad habit all those days of being a little bit long-nosed about Russian engineering, how it was crude and all of that. I beg your pardon, they are brilliant engineers, and they proved it over and over again. When they first opened up their Shoghi laboratory in 1993, I was over there, just happened to be there and happened to go. And I'm a wind tunnel aerodynamicist by training, and really originally a profession. They had wind tunnels that NASA would give their right arm to have, and they ran them on 1/10 of the budget that NASA runs them on. They didn't have all of the flack and the publicity and the show that went with it. They had concrete block walls with awful good tools. And they had some wind tunnels that were unbelievable, still are, and nothing matches in the United States today. And they would have been tough in a technological war. Well, they were tough, huh?
Anything that I've left out that you think is important?
I don't know. What's important is that I wish we could get out of this moratorium where we're living on World War II, how good we were, memorabilia, museums, legends of flight, all the things you guys are doing, and start put that kind of money, time, and effort in the future. And then we would take another explosive growth. It's going to happen, but we're not going to, the old guys aren't going to like the way the young people do it. But they're going to do it. The computers were that kind of thing, gave us tools. The bureaucracy made us think that the computers are smarter than we were, but we'll get over that too. But if you stop and think, all of this celebrating that we do about how good we are, if we could just put that kind of money and effort in the future. But the last try I had, and it took me almost 20 years to get it off the ground and go on, was the National Aerospace plane. We almost got over the hump, but we couldn't quite do it. And I got that canceled myself because I couldn't do to the taxpayer what they were doing. You know, it needed a leader. It needed a dedication, because when you do something that hard, it's like a war. You know, the leaders surface, but we just never got far enough into it that it would work. You know, the Kelly Johnsons and the Harrison Storms and those kind of guys. And they would have surfaced, but we couldn't go so long. They were already spent $3 billion. They hadn't drawn a center line. And yet you knew it was doable. I could make it doable on my home computer. But for some reason or other, everybody wanted to make a tremendous effort out of it. Much like when we started to talk about going to the moon, everybody said we couldn't. In fact, it wasn't until Kennedy died that it really got to be a serious effort. You know, and they just said, why don't we? So if anything that we're leaving out right now, we have done nothing really in space and aeronautics in the last 30, 40 years. The space station is a godsend. I wish it were all ours. It gives us the opportunity to make sure World War III never occurs, because we can look at the Earth pretty thoroughly and know what everybody's doing, and if we don't play Chamberlain, we'll stop them. We'll have to, because the next one's going to be a mean one. Well, they're all mean. But I work a lot with aerospace education, and we were talking a little bit earlier out here with children and all that, but we're not going to push them into aviation and space. They're going to find their own way to do it. In fact, I think if we objected, they would move faster than if we tried to push them into it. That's the nature of young people, isn't it?
Magic that was there for a kid nowadays for aviation that there was when you were
No, no way. The Dayton kid isn't sitting on a fence dreaming anymore. And you know, we could fix that. I mean, there are a lot of ways if we just had the balls to do it. But today we count the beans and we get insurance, we don't take risks, we don't do this. And if a youngster wants to learn to fly today, what does he learn to fly? In a 152. Now, what bright up-and-coming young man wants to fly in a 152? But we have little jet engines today that, I want one of those, huh? And we could make a cheap trainer below $100,000, the cost of a sports car. And, but the risk, the cost, you know, that's the thing. The risk, nobody is willing to take a professional or a monetary risk this day and age. And the history of aviation are people going broke because their heart, you know, led way out in front. If you go to the Air and Space Museum, just stand in that foyer, look at all the heart that's in there. And not much of that costs much money. I can give an example, and that is that the research airplane program was 30 years up through the X-15, was about 30 variations of about 13 or 14 basic configurations. The whole cost of all that hardware and the operations over that 30 years was less than $500 million. $500 million, less than $500 million. You couldn't bid on one of those today. All of the reports that came out of the X-15 might be that thick. Your bid today would be that thick to make an X-15. And that's what was beginning to happen to the aerospace plane. It was doable. You could prove analytically that while there are a lot of things we had to learn, just like with the X-15 and the Apollo and everything else, that we could do it. But you have to do it with a lot of heart in it. And we've changed quite a bit. It used to be that a general would say, hey, do that, and he'd do it. But today he has to ask his colonels to study it, and then he has to follow their recommendation. And that's no way to run a ball game, I don't think. We could do an awful lot in aviation right now if we just made up our mind and go do it. And here I'm sitting here talking about it. Probably I should be doing it too. Well, the National Aerospace Plan was, we put out the first contract in 1986. And it was to be an effort to make an orbital turnaround vehicle that would go to space as an air breather. About 78% of the load lifted off of the Cape Canaveral on the space shuttle is oxygen, and it's to be had for free in the atmosphere. You know, every engine we have, except rockets, uses Earth's atmosphere to breathe. If we could do that, we could reduce the cost of going to space by maybe 2 orders of magnitude. Instead of $1,400 or $140, maybe $14 a pound. And it was a dream of a lot of us to now sophisticate all we'd learned through the brutishness of rocket technology, which is the only way we could do it. So we had a scheme for an air-breathing airplane that would take off from a runway, fly to orbit, and you can as an air breather. People say, oh, there's no air up there, but there are ways to do this. even if we did have to use rockets, and I would have accepted that, the last 3 or 4 Mach numbers, that's okay too, and return. And that would be kind of make the space station and the space shuttle really be meaningful, so we'd have some alacrity and flexibility and turnaround capability to go into space. And really, NASA was interested in Mars, and other people were talking about going to the moon, and I kind of think our problems here on Earth to solve these problems first. Cislunar space is where we're going to really get the advantage of these new technology. We've already got a tremendous advantage from it. Well, the aerospace plane was supposed to do that, and one of the derivatives was a Mach 5 transport. What Reagan called, or used our name, the Orient Express. I don't remember that. It would take aerospace plane technology to do the Orient Express, and it was very attractive in that you could fly from New York to Beijing in under 2 hours. And actually, it turned out to be very good economically because, you know, time and speed is really where the economics come into this thing. But that didn't get very far. It did a lot of good, though, because my scheme was that we ought to be a nation against the world, much as Russia was, rather than a company against the world. So why not muster an alliance of all of our major airframe manufacturers to build a national aerospace plane? Then we get the benefit of all of the talent and input in the country, with a tremendous financial base to make it possible. We did that with materials. The phase 1 was just to look at all of the materials. And all of the engineering people from the 5 major manufacturers got together, and we had quantum leaps in our understanding of materials. High solidification ratio metals, you know, some of these glass metals that we had, controlling the structure, the crystal structure of metals and all of that, which just started a whole new world of materials. Carbon fibers are one of those things, and look at what we're getting out of carbon fiber material today, compound materials. And that worked pretty well, and everybody got together and shared it. And in that scheme, no company was barred from doing what they wanted, but each one of them had a main aim to take care of, you know, whether it be metals, organic materials, so whatever it was. But when we tried to do the aerospace plane, we had the 5 industries got together, and it was led by North American, which would have been a good leader, but they didn't put an engineer in charge. They put a Harvard MBA in charge. That was, I shouldn't be that critical, but nevertheless, the companies got to arguing about, well, you got the last engineering decision, let's vote. I want the next one. Well, you don't do that. And that was this bureaucracy working. And actually, they spent an awful lot of money and weren't getting anywhere. And so I talked to the congressman I was working with on this thing at the time. I was a technical advisor at Congress at that time. Told him, hey, let's cancel this. We can't do this to the taxpayer, you know. $3 billion before you get started, you know, and it would have been as expensive maybe as Apollo. But the results would have been well worthwhile. We would have shrunk the Earth down to size. We would have had a lot of commerce in space, not just one space station that we try to get money out of Russia to help us build and that sort of thing. But everyone had their own axe to grind rather than, it takes a leader, a real leader to lead a thing like that, and he didn't surface. That's really what
Are we the same country? Do we have the same national character and national spirit that won World War II that could do the test pilot program, or has it all been lost?
Yeah. It's always been difficult to motivate this country. This goes from the Revolutionary War through the Civil War, the Spanish-American War. We've always been, you know, we can get together again to do anything. And we've had an awful lot of large immigration here since, say, Cuba and all of that. We've got, again, the best of the world in that. We're ready to do anything, and we can. That was a mistake that Hitler kind of seemed to think that we were decadent, and we weren't going to be able to stand up to him. Well, he got his arse whipped, and we can do that again if necessary, and we're in a position to do it. Yes, we are the same country, though they're an awful... Nothing's perfect, I guess. This country's not perfect. It was constructed so that it's virtually indestructible as a system. And that's because, incidentally, 3 engineers designed the country, Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin. And they did. They used the engineering method. I could just lay out how we build our country to the engineering method. So when one part gets a little weak, the other parts can carry it. But it had its problems. Certainly there was not a union in the 1860s, huh? And there's still not a union. But when we go to war, we go to war, and we'll win it. I wish we could go to war with the technology that's there for us to do, because, and use this computer here. These computers, they're good tools, but the real computer is the inventive mind, isn't it? And it could take us a long way into what we would like to do. We have done that. We don't take advantage of it. We try to kill ourselves. For instance, nobody ever thought that the Middle West, that dry country, would be the world's breadbasket, huh? We made it that way, one plowshare at a time. And we've done that with industry. Yet we've given all that industry away, sometimes foolishly, sometimes through just decisions made by people who thought they knew what they were talking about. As Jimmy Carter gave away the carbon fiber business to Japan through a rather presumptuous, patronizing attitude that he knew all there was to know about engineering. We knew it was happening. There wasn't a thing we could do about it. And if we just quit, doing those dumb things, we never will. We'll always manage. So I'm not a pessimist about this country at all. There's a lot of negative, but there's an awful lot positive going for us. And as I mentioned earlier, I've lectured from Miami to Seattle and from Caltech to MIT, and this is the smartest generation we've ever had. The last couple of generations, I guess I've outlived 2 or 3 of them. And I'm hoping to just kick all the old guys out, start doing it their way. Because, the example isn't what you follow. I'm lecturing now. Those people that say people that ignore history are bound to repeat it, that's a bunch of baloney. The more we learn about history, the more we're bound to repeat it. It's the way we've always done it, huh? Look, it worked before, why doesn't it work now? One of the best things we had at Edwards were the research airplanes, where we were all young, everybody in their 30s or less. We had really virtually no boss because we were doing what there was no precedent, no rules, no regulations, anything for. So we did what came naturally. We just made things work. And I think that early on this country did that, but we have kind of bogged ourselves down, and we're the last great socialist republic in the world. And that'll break. We'll get over that. I think people will make it work.
I interviewed Paul Tibbets last year.
Oh, yeah?
And he was funny. He didn't want to do the interview. And
he's not too anxious to get publicity.
No. So he said, I asked him one question, and he talked for about a half hour. He just went through everything. So the hearing wasn't much of a factor.
He's got selective hearing. He hears you.
The X-15, designed to be purely and simply a research vehicle to provide aerodynamic, flight dynamic, and structural response data for use in the development of future manned hypersonic vehicles, such as the Space Shuttle. No hypersonic wind tunnels, past or present, can provide accurate data for the design of a full-scale hypersonic airplane. The frontiers of flight today are the same as they were in the 1950s, the exploration of hypersonic flight. The X-15 will ultimately be viewed as the Wright Flyer of hypersonic airplanes. The X-15 flew to speeds and altitudes never previously achieved by winged vehicles. On the crisp, clear morning of November 9, 1961, a prospector working any of the many small mining claims in the bleak country around Mud Lake would have noticed the telltale broad white contrail signaling the approach of a strange formation of aircraft. If his eyesight was particularly acute, he might have discerned a giant Boeing NB-52B Stratofortress arrowing through Nevada's dark blue sky, flanked by two sleek little fighters, a North American F-100 Super Sabre and a Lockheed F-104 Starfighter. As he watched, he might have seen a long black dart drop from the B-52, followed by the sudden boom and crackling rumble of an igniting rocket engine. Boosted by 60,000 pounds of thrust, it leapt ahead of the big bomber and its chase planes, accelerating upwards as it burned a ton of anhydrous ammonia and liquid oxygen every 12 seconds. It arced into the trans-atmosphere, its white exhaust trail pointing like a finger toward the future. Not quite 90 seconds later, it was level at 102,000 feet, streaking towards Edwards Air Force Base in Southern California at Mach 6.04. Air Force test pilot Major Robert White had just become the first man to take an airplane to Mach 6, 6 times the speed of sound, flying the second of 3 North American Aviation X-15 research airplanes. Slightly less than 8 minutes and 200 miles later, trailed by another F-104 chase plane, the X-15, its propellants exhausted and now the world's fastest glider, dropped into a steep curve to a landing flare and touchdown on runway 18. Marked out on the hard-baked clay of Rogers Dry Lake, the world's largest natural landing site. The X-15 program was a natural outgrowth of progression of aviation since the time of the Wrights. The biplane had given way to the streamlined monoplane, and by the late 1930s, the first experimental jet engines had appeared, promising an era of high-speed flight. But as an airplane flew closer to the speed of sound, it encountered compressibility, the bunching up of air around it as it neared Mach 1, causing high drag, buffeting, changes in structural loads, and even loss of control and in-flight breakups. For more than a decade, until Chuck Yeager flew the first Bell XS-1, later X-1, to Mach 1.06 in October of 1947, it seemed that the speed of sound might indeed be a barrier to the future flight. Afterward, aviation accelerated rapidly into the supersonic era. Mach 2 fell to Scott Crossfield, and the second Douglas D558-2 skyrocket in November 1953, and Mach 3 to Captain Milburn Apt and the first Bell X-2 in September 1956, though tragically, he perished when the plane went out of control during its return to Edwards. By the time of Apt's death, the X-15 program was well underway. Its designers faced formidable challenges. Bell had built advanced variants of the X-1 that could excel at Mach 2 and 90,000 feet, and the swept-wing X-2 could climb above 125,000 feet. Both hinted at control challenges the X-15 would face. In 1956, when test pilot Captain Ivan C. Kinch coasted to above 126,000 feet, his X-2 was like an artillery shell following a ballistic parabola. Near the top of its climb, as the plane decelerated after its rocket engine ran out of propellant, its ailerons, elevators, and rudder were useless due to the very low dynamic pressure encountered as it passed through the upper atmosphere. The X-2 began a slow left roll, arced over the top of its ballistic parabola, and, as its speed and, consequently, dynamic pressure increased in the lower atmosphere, its flight controls regained their effectiveness, and Kinchlow was able to guide it back to a safe landing on Edwards Broad Lake bed. Clearly, flying above 100,000 feet, future rocket planes would require reaction controls, small jet thrusters such as those employed on the first manned spacecraft, in addition to conventional aerodynamic control surfaces. Aerodynamic heating and the high-altitude environment pose their own problems. Unlike supersonic flight, which is differentiated by the speed of sound and the distinctive crack of a sonic boom, Hypersonic flight is characterized primarily by increasing aerodynamic heating with intensity hot airflows and sharply angled shockwaves washing over the structure, their interactions producing even greater heat. The structure could not be conventional, for the plane would be subject to skin temperatures above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, necessitating extensive thermal protection. Inside the fully pressurized cockpit, the pilot would be more astronaut than airman, wearing a pressure suit and helmet capable of functioning in space-like conditions should cabin pressure be lost. Interest in hypersonic flight predated the supersonic revolution. The three great prophets of the space age, Russia's Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the Romanian-German Hermann Oberth, and America's Robert Goddard, all advocated hypersonic airplanes as a means of flying into space, and German rocket enthusiast Max Valier, before his death and the explosion of an experimental rocket engine, recommended developing rocket-powered either planes as intercontinental airliners. In the 1930s, Austrian engineer Eugen Sanger and the mathematician Irene Brett undertook the world's first science-based hypersonic design, their so-called Silbervogel, silver bird. Proposed as a space transport and later as a global strike aircraft, it became an extraordinarily influential design study. Right after World War II, Joseph Stalin, according to a Soviet military defector, even sent a team into Western Europe on a fruitless mission to kidnap authors, hoping that Soviet Sanga planes would make it easier for us to talk to the gentleman shopkeeper, Harry Truman. The combination of the Sanga-Brett study and example of a Nazi A4V2 ballistic missile greatly simulated post-war American, Soviet, and European interest in rockets, missiles, and hypersonic aircraft. While the Sanga-Brett study had been purely theoretical, the A4 program had extensively studied Mach 4 Plus wing derivatives, one of which, the A4B, flew before war's end, though it broke up during its terminal glide to Earth. The Soviet-American race to develop atomic-armed ballistic missiles fostered heating and re-entry studies, evolution of the blunt body re-entry shape, and high-temperature materials research. It also encouraged studies of rocket-boosted winged global-ranging hypersonic vehicles, even orbital spacecraft. In America, from all this, sprang the X-15 and X-20 programs, though the latter never flew. The roots of the X-15 reflected a broad base of military, industrial, and governmental research support. In 1951, Robert Woods, Bell Aircraft Corporation's chief engineer and a member of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, prestigious aeronautics committee, called for development of new research airplane with performance similar to the A4's. His continued pressure led NACA's executive committee to endorse, a year later, investigating flight conditions between Mach 4 and Mach 10. The agency formed a hypersonic study committee under Langley Aeronautical Laboratory, now NASA Langley Research Center, engineer Clinton Brown, which subsequently advocated greatly expanded ground and flight research tests using models and specialized test techniques. The committee even suggested modifying the X-2 with a strap-on booster to increase performance above Mach 4, adding reaction controls for flight safety. Program delays and eventual loss of both airplane doomed that idea. In 1953, the Air Force's Scientific Advisory Board concluded the time is ripe for a Mach 5 to 7 hypersonic vehicle, and the U.S. Navy's Office of Naval Research issued a study contract to Douglas for a Mach 7 plus design, tentatively designated the D558-3. Air Force and Navy interest proved crucial to getting the X-15 program off the drawing board and into the air. The next year, 1954, marked the genesis of the X-15. Another NACA study team, headed by John Becker, undertook preliminary design of a Mach 6 rocket-boosted hypersonic research airplane. It had a nickel alloy and Connell structure, rocket-like four-fin tail, and off-shelf rockets from the Hermes program. Becker's study anticipated many of the X-15's features, and encouraged NACA that summer to invite the military services to join with it in developing such an aircraft. In October, they formed the NACA Air Force Navy Research Aircraft Committee, subsequently known as the X-15 Committee. A joint program directive issued on December 23rd gave technical oversight to NACA and design and construction authority to the Air Force. The Navy and Air Force would jointly fund the effort. The Air Force supervised a design competition in 1955 between Bell, Douglas, North American, and Republic. Bell's Robert Woods, who had launched the company's earlier X-1 effort, might reasonably have expected his firm to win, since it had already built and flown the X-1, X-2, and X-5. Douglas's Ed Heinemann, with his D-55-8 Skystreak and Skyrocket, plus the D-55-3 Study, might have as well. Both companies produced relatively cheap designs, each promising to deliver 3 airplanes for a total cost of $36 million. Harrison's Stormy Storms, a veteran of North American's many fighter programs, led the design team that drafted his firm's entry, at an estimated $56 million, the most expensive proposal. But both Bell and Douglas's designs were considered too technically risky, and Republic's, which was technically insufficient and also more costly than the Bell and Douglas proposals, came in last. Accordingly, despite the huge cost disparity, the Air Force notified North American on September 30th that it had won the competition. On June 11th, 1956, after final negotiations, North American received a $42.9 million contract, about $349 million today, for the 3 X-15s. 3 months later, Reaction Motors Incorporated was awarded with a $10.7 million contract for their engines. The X-15 program involved far more than simply designing a new airplane, however novel it might be. Its rocket engine, pilot protection system, environmental controls and flight control system, as well as its flight test range, posed complex challenges. The X-15's XLR-99 engine, more than 3 times as powerful as the X-2s and 8 times as powerful as the X-1s, proved particularly risky. Developed by New Jersey-based Reaction Motors, the XLR-99 was based on the earlier XLR-30, used in the Navy's Viking high-altitude rocket program. Any hopes that the Viking experience would help with its design proved illusory. Unlike the XLR-30, which burned diluted alcohol and liquid oxygen, the 57,000-pound thrust XLR-99 burned 1,445 gallons of more explosive anhydrous ammonia and 1,000 gallons of iox. More significant, however, Tahikol had to man-rate the engine, i.e., make it safe enough for operation in a piloted airplane, capable of repeated use, and both throttleable and restartable in flight. This was not easy to achieve, particularly as its high-speed turbopump, a potential source of disaster, fed the engine propellants at a rate of 167 pounds per second. Eventually, the XLR-99 became a reliable power plant, with a rated operational life of about 1 hour, about 40 flights before requiring overhaul. Such reliability came at a price for a far longer than anticipated development period, compelling North American to complete the first 2 X-15s with older XLR-11 engines for their proving flights. The X-15 required a complex flight control system, a conventional fighter-like stick controlled an all-moving tail that furnished pitch and roll control, but was used only during approach and landing. During high G acceleration, climb, and re-entry, the pilot relied on a side-stick controller. A reaction control system operating small hydrogen peroxide jet thrusters located in the nose and wings furnished pitch, roll, and yaw inputs at high altitudes, where conventional controls were ineffective. Eventually, the third X-15s flew with an adaptive flight control system that automatically compensated for changing dynamic pressure, blending the reaction control system with the conventional aerodynamic controls. Since the X-15 was technically a boost glider, once it exhausted its propellants, the pilot had to carefully manage his energy to ensure he could reach Rogers Dry Lake. To help him in doing this, the X-15 would always be flown so that it had excess energy at burnout, which the pilot could use as bleed-off using large pedal-like speed brakes installed in the side of a massive dorsal and ventral fins. Unlike earlier rocket-powered aircraft that flew near Edwards AFB, the X-15 demanded a special flight test corridor, dubbed the High Range, running roughly 480 miles from Wendover, Utah, southwest to Edwards. Crossing multiple mountain ranges in the stark southwestern desert, the High Range was itself a notable technical accomplishment, foreshadowing the manned spacecraft tracking network NASA established for Project Mercury several years later. NASA furnished 2 tracking stations at Ely and Beatty, Nevada, as well as at Edwards. Furthermore, unlike research airplanes, the X-15 required a complex flight simulator to train pilots and undertake mission planning and rehearsal. The simulator was updated using data required during X-15 flights, with pilots typically spending 40 to 50 hours in it before undertaking a 10 to 12-minute flight. When the program commenced, it was hoped the X-15 might be flying by the end of 1957. Due to the complexity of its design and technical challenges involved, however, test flights did not begin until 1959. In the interim, NASA and the Air Force supported the X-15 development effort with extensive wind tunnel and free flight ballistic tunnel testing, evaluated reaction controls on ground simulator rigs and on modified research airplanes including the Bell X-1B and F-104, and undertook extensive simulation studies to prepare for the crucial challenges faced by a hypersonic rocket plane having, for its first time, the lowest lift-to-drag ratio ever flown on a piloted aircraft. In October 1957, Sputnik had seized the public imagination, and the national debate over American science and technology that followed, NACA had given way to the space-focused NASA. Now the X-15 took on greater urgency and visibility as a symbol of America's progression into space. Vice President Richard Nixon presided over its rollout at North American's Los Angeles facility on October 15, 1958. A year after the Soviet satellite ushered in the new space age. It was a remarkable-looking aircraft, burnished metallic black, with thin wings and horizontal tail surfaces, and, because of the directional stability requirements of high supersonic and hypersonic flight, large meat-cleaver dorsal and ventral vertical fins, the lower half of the ventral surface jettisonable during landing approach so that the X-15's landing skids could be a reasonable size. Although planners had originally thought the X-15 would use a modified Convair B-36 as a mothership, the retirement of the B-36 and the availability of the more powerful and capable B-52A led to its substitution for Convair's giant intercontinental bomber. Early tests with the X-15 proved far from encouraging. Piloted by North American test pilot Scott Crossfield, who had been so dedicated to the project that, as it began, he left NACA for North American, the first X-15, AF-56-6670, made its maiden captive flight on March 10, 1959, followed by its first glide flight on June 8th. During the landing approach, Crossfield encountered serious longitudinal control problems that pushed his piloting skills to the limit, necessitating adjustments to the boosted flight control system. The second X-15, AF-56-6671, made the type's first powered flight on September 17th. Propelled by 2 XLR-11 engines, it reached Mach 2.11 at 52,341 feet. He completed another powered flight into Mach 2.15 a month later, but then, on November 5th, disaster struck when an engine fire forced an emergency landing on Rosamond Dry Lake, during which 6,671 broke its back. While the second X-15 returned to North American for repairs and installation of its XLR-99, proving flights continued through 1960, with 6670 still equipped with its interim XLR-11s. The third X-15, AF-56-6672, was the first completed with the big Tahicle XLR-99. But during an Edwards ground test, the engine blew up, catapulting the rest of the airplane forward. Safe in its cockpit, Crossfield marveled at the X-15's strength and worried for the safety of crews trying to extricate him. The plane, like the second X-15, returned to North American for a rebuild. Not until November 15, 1960, 3 years late, would the X-15 fly with its XLR-99 engine, when Crossfield took 6671 to Mach 2.97, marking the end of its contractor flight test program. But now, the X-15 hits its stride. On March 7, 1961, Air Force Major Robert M. White became the first pilot to exceed Mach 4. He piloted the second X-15 across the hypersonic divide on June 23rd, attaining Mach 5.72. White completed a sonic trifecta by exceeding Mach 6 on November 9th, as previously mentioned. Nor was the boyish airman the X-15's only record setter. On August 22, 1963, NASA research pilot Joseph Walker attained 354,200 feet in the third X-15, taking it into space. Marring this was a serious landing accident on November 9, 1962, that virtually destroyed the second X-15 and seriously injured NASA pilots Jack McKay. When an engine failure necessitated a heavyweight emergency landing on Mud Lake, 6671's skid landing gear collapsed. Even this setback was turned to advantage, for NASA lengthened the X-15 and added provisions for 2 huge drop tanks and a dummy supersonic combustion ramjet engine installation on the shortened lower vertical fin. Eventually, on October 3, 1967, Major William J. Pete Knight reached Mach 6.7 flying this aircraft, designated the X-15A2. During the flight, unanticipated heating led to multiple structural failures, causing the scramjet module to separate from the aircraft and damaging the fuel jettison system. Knight, a superlative airman, landed safely. Sadly, shortly after Knight's remarkable flight, the fastest by a piloted airplane in the 20th century, Air Force test pilot Major Michael Adams, was killed in the third X-15. On November 15, 1967, during a high-altitude flight, it entered a Mach 5 plus spin, and it broke well above Mach 4 during an inverted dive into the lower atmosphere. The accident stemmed from a fatal combustion of instrumentation and control systems failures, plus human factors. Less than a year later, on October 24, 1968, the X-15 completed its last flight, its 199th, flown by NASA pilot William Dana. NASA attempted a 200th flight on December 20th, but Edward was typically swathed in snow. Planners took it as an omen and simply retired the craft. The first X-15 went to the National Air and Space Museum, where it may be seen in the Milestones of Flight Gallery, and the second, the fastest airplane of the 20th century, to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. Altogether, 12 distinguished pilots, Scott Crossfield, Robert White, Forrest Peterston, Neil Armstrong, Joe Walker, Jack McKay, Milt Thompson, Robert Rushworth, Mike Adams, Bill Dana, Pete Knight, and Joe Engel had flown the X-15 to speeds and altitudes never previously achieved by winged vehicles. Its research program consisted of an aerodynamic and structural heating investigation phase from 1959 through 1963, and a follow-on program utilizing the X-15 to carry experiments into the upper atmosphere or to hypersonic speeds. Much of the applications program benefited from the contemporaneous Apollo effort, but it also helped sensor and missile detection efforts. X-15 flights produced more than 700 technical reports, establishing a database still considered essential today, as hypersonics advances into the second century of flight. The X-15 was by no means a perfect research vehicle. Under some circumstances, it had dangerous flight characteristics, and heavy impact loads sorely texted its landing skids. During re-entry, in-flight reconnaissance effects could interact with its flight control system. Early on, researchers discovered gaps in panels that permitted the entry of hot hypersonic air into its structure, necessitating fixes. Cockpit outer window panels shattered from heat-distorted panel frame structural loads, forcing redesign, and its nose landing gear twice extended in flight due to thermal stress. There were several landing incidents and accidents, one major ground explosion, and, of course, the sad loss of the third X-15 with Mike Adams. But overall, as a product of the pre-computer design era, and without the benefit of modern tools such as computational fluid dynamics and computer-aided design and manufacturing, the X-15 constituted a remarkable achievement, and an astonishing productive research program bridging the age of flight and the age of space. Fittingly, two of its most distinguished pilots went on to greater fame in the U.S. space program. Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon, and Joe Engel became one of NASA's first space shuttle mission commanders. Today, Air Force and NASA researchers pursue Mach 6 hypersonic flight with the air-breathing Boeing Pratt & Whitney Rocketdyne X-51A Wave Rider scramjet research vehicle. Tellingly, its designation, X-51, was deliberately chosen and reserved to echo the X-15 and remind researchers of the remarkable aircraft that, a half a century ago, did so much to make hypersonic flight a reality.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.